The Berkeley Forum is thrilled to partner with GSPP on this event today. The Berkeley Forum is a student-run, nonpartisan organization here at Cal that hosts talks, panels, and debates on our campus. Driven by students, for students, our members work tirelessly throughout the semester to enhance intellectual discussion on campus by bringing speakers to talk about the most urgent ideas of our time. If you're interested in finding out more about us, you can follow us on Facebook or find us on our website at forum.berkeley.edu, where you can also look into our crowdfunding campaign that we're doing during the month of October if you're interested in seeing more events like this one. I'm now pleased to introduce Dee Dee Van Lobensels, who is a member of the Cal class of 1968 and the co-chair with Bob Wong of the Center of Civility and Democratic Engagement Advisory Board. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Haley. It's very exciting to have the Berkeley Forum and the Cal class of 68, a span of 50 years, welcoming all of you today. This class of 68 founded the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement as our legacy project at the Goldman School of Public Policy, and we are your co-sponsor. Our class has been gathering quarterly for nearly 15 years, and you are welcome to attend our gatherings. We meet quarterly, enriching experiences with Berkeley professors, campus tours, and campus leaders, 3 times in Berkeley a year and 1 time in the South Bay and Marin. So please receive notice of these gatherings. Sign up as you leave today. You are welcome, and we'd love to have you join us. And thank you for coming and demonstrating your interest in civil discussion of pressing needs. And to continue your interests, please get involved and support the center, much needed Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement. And we want to thank our speakers, obviously, for being here today, we so appreciate you giving your Saturday to all of us. And to thank Lynn Serta Price, Hannah Young, and our Cal of 68 classmates, Peter Munoz and Dan Lindheim, for making today happen. Now to introduce our moderator. He is the faculty director of the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement and teaches at the Goldman School of Public Policy. Our Cal classmate, has a bachelor's, 2 masters, and a PhD from Cal. He focused on economics, urban planning, and public health. He was even on the Cal tennis team. And he has a law degree from Georgetown. That wasn't enough. Dan has a diverse background in both the public and private sectors, a very abbreviated list. He was CEO of 2 high-tech software companies, worked as a World Bank economist and a senior advisor to committees of the House of Representatives. And most recently, he was Oakland's city administrator. Pretty amazing, right? I suggest you read more about Dan on the Goldman's school website. Thank you, Dan, for telling us more about the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement and for being our moderator.
Actually, what that all goes to show is that if you know how to hustle, you can get a lot of degrees while you're actually working full time. The center's mission stems from a fundamental tenet of the class of 68, that real public participation coupled with meaningful public debate is critical for democracy. The center promotes debate through research, teaching, fellowships, internships, public events, and encourages current and future leaders to engage people of different backgrounds and different views in the development and resolution of public policy. I want to give one note about the title of this panel. Obviously, this is not a panel of white working class voters. This is an academic discussion where academics talk about what they have studied about white academic voters. We got a note in the Facebook page from one of my former students saying, "Hey Dan, where are all the white working class voters on your panel?" So anyway, I just wanted to say that we're aware of that discrepancy. I just want to give you some sense of how this is going to play out. We're going to hear first from each of the panelists, and then we will have 2 questions from the Berkeley Forum, from students from the Berkeley Forum, and then after that we'll have this moderated conversation, and then there'll be Q&A from the audience. So hold your questions at least until we get to that point. So our first panelist is Arlie Hochschild. She's Professor Emerita in the Department of Sociology here at Cal. She's written more than 10 books. I was trying to add them all up, and I had a hard time because, anyway, there were more than 10. She's done field work and written about older residents of a low-income housing project, about flight attendants, about bill collectors, working parents trying to divide housework and childcare, corporate employees dealing with a culture of workaholism, and Filipina nannies who left their children behind in order to care for children here in the United States. Her recent book, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning in the American Right, was based on 5 years of intensive interviews with Tea Party enthusiasts in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Her book received high acclaim. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, and both the book and Arlie have been at the center of a raging debate about the appropriate future of American politics. Many of our board members read her book, and there was actually a groundswell from the board of the class of '68 to absolutely insist on inviting Arlie, and that is why she is here, and I'd like to call her to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. I'm delighted to be here and to put together both the culture of the class of 1968 here at Berkeley with the idea of civil discourse across a very powerful divide. I thought what I'd do in my minutes with you here is first to share with you a journey that I have just returned from, and then to pick up the whole issue of whether, in fact, the use of talking across this wide divide, and who we should talk to and how we should talk to them. So I'd like to share the journey and then tell you my thoughts after that. In 2011, I already had a sense, as I think we all did, sort of finger to the wind, whoa, there is a growing right wing. And I realized I didn't know anyone who was ardently right-wing, that I was in a bubble, both the geographic one as a citizen of Berkeley, a media bubble, I read the New York Times religiously, and an electronic bubble as our computers give us back to ourselves. So I thought, I don't know what's going on, but everything I've spent my life working on is now in danger, and I don't get it. So I decided to try and locate a bubble that was as far right as I think sociology department at UC Berkeley in the town of Berkeley is left, and see if I could take my alarm system off and try and climb an empathy wall so I could really get a sense of the experiences that are informing a view of the world, which is not my own. So that took me to the South, where the right has grown the fastest, and then it took me to the super South, Louisiana, and then within Louisiana, it took me to the petrochemical center in the Southwest, around Lake Charles, Westlake, Sulphur. But I also wandered for over the 5 years, the whole south of the state and the mid parts of the state. So I brought with me a kind of a question that is the red state paradox familiar to us all. How could it be that it's the poorest states, the states with the most disrupted family, the worst education, the worst health care, the most road accidents, the lowest life expectancy, the most pollution, are also the states that receive more money from the federal government in aid than they give to it in tax dollars, and they revile the federal government. Wait a minute, if you have a problem, wouldn't you welcome some help? Louisiana turned out to be an exaggerated version of that red state paradox. Second poorest state, 44% of the state budget came from the federal government, and overwhelmingly sympathetic to the Tea Party. So I thought I was just trying to find a little enclave of Tea Party right-wingers, but actually I discovered that it was a culture. I found myself within a general culture that was suspicious of federal aid. So I thought to myself, okay, perfect. I'm where I need to be. And I began to realize that the sky was very gray, and if I drove to Westlake, my eyes would begin to sting, and that this was one of the most polluted areas in the country. But the residents opposed regulations of industry. So they're living with pollution and seem to oppose the idea or be suspicious of the idea of regulating the polluters. So I thought, again, perfect, this is what I don't get. And just to condense my journey here, what I realized in talking to people is that that red state paradox, they knew it was there. They were not ignorant of it, but they just kind of set it aside, the way we do have a kind of a knowledge that we set aside. And what was rising up in its stead, pushing that knowledge aside, was what I came to think of as a deep story. Now, what's a deep story? A deep story is what feels true to you about something important to you. You take facts out of the deep story. You take moral precepts out of the deep story. It's just what feels true. And I believe, the right has a deep story. I think the left does too. And that if we're really going to talk to each other, we have to talk deep story to deep story. The right deep story can be told almost like a dream, where you're waiting in line, you're, as in a pilgrimage, facing the top of the hill at which you see the American dream. And you feel a sense of deserving. You've worked extremely hard. You see yourself as law-abiding. And the line hasn't moved. People I talked to who were blue-collar, a lot of them were pipe fitters and plumbers and electricians, and they hadn't had a raise in 2 decades. So the line wasn't moving. But they're hopeful, and as they experienced themselves, didn't know animus toward anybody, but they just had their eye on that goal. And then, in the right-wing deep story, they see line cutters. Well, who would that be? That would be blacks who, through federally mandated affirmative action programs, finally and at last have access to jobs that have been historically reserved for whites. Even worse, are women, 50% of the population, who through the same federal legislation finally have access to jobs that have been historically reserved for men. I'm an example. And then immigrants, undocumented, and refugees. And even animals they saw as cutting in line. They said, oh, these environmentalists, they put animals over people. And then another moment of the right-wing deep story it looks like the president, who should be impartially supervising the line, is waving at the line cutters. Oh, isn't he a line cutter too? So many people over the 5 years asked me, well, how did Barack Obama's mother afford a Harvard education? She wasn't a rich woman. Something fishy. And then that fit into a lot of paranoia that I experienced. So then they felt kind of pushed back in line and ignored. They felt unrecognized. They felt their culture wasn't the mainstream culture anymore. Their jobs had become more shaky. Religion, very fundamental to nearly everyone I talked to, they felt there's a secularization and churches were being put down. And then this. And the final moment of the right-wing deep story is that someone from Berkeley, someone from Coast, someone highly educated, gets, and someone much closer to the American dream, turns around and says, oh, you racist, sexist, homophobic, fat, ignorant redneck. And for them, that was that word redneck. That was it. They felt insulted. All their work felt unseen in the eyes of people that they took to be on the other side of this partisan divide. So I went back to people that I came to know. Does this make sense to you? One man said, you read my mind. Another one said, I live your metaphor. Others would say, well, no, you've left something out. It's the people who are waiting or the one paying taxes for the line cutters. So, this is what I came back with. But you know, I came back with another paradox. And that is, went in with the red paradox, but I came back with a blue state paradox. How could it be that the Democratic Party, the party of the working man and the working woman, is not speaking to anybody that I saw? That's my paradox. That's our paradox. And it presents us with, I think, an enormous task. I came back for my 5 years thinking, okay, how do we talk across this big divide? And I was getting emails, I couldn't believe my email, of people that kind of wanted, they felt an urge to cross this divide. One woman who was part of a parishioner in an Episcopal church in Massachusetts said, oh, could you set me up with a parish in Lake Charles so we can talk? There were people who said, can't we get student exchanges going? Realizing that region, class, and race were the big dividers, that votes are hinged to those. Don't we need to get more structural arrangements to allow us to talk to each other? So we used to have a compulsory draft which put, for men, people of different social classes and races together. They got to know each other. And we used to have a vibrant union movement, which again, for workers, put people of races and class together. But we don't have those anymore. And I think what's happened today is that in the absence of those, we're left to the leadership of a president who has no interest in fostering, I believe, unity, and who provides a terrible model for cross-partisan talk. We may differ on that. But, and in the absence of structural arrangements and the presence of a highly problematic model, I think we need to be the adults in the room. We need to be the ones that stand up and say, you know what, we can do this thing. That if you look at the public political discourse, almost nada. People yell at each other and have kind of attack, defend modalities. And no alarm systems are off, no listening is happening. But there is a nascent grassroots movement, I'm thrilled to say. And if you were to Google something called the bridgealliance.us, you would find it as an umbrella movement, umbrella organization that covers some 70, now 80 different organizations. They aren't this structural method, but there's something they'll do in the interim. They have funny names like Hi from the Other Side, or Making Evening Dinner Again, and Living Room Conversations, which I have done with our very own Joan Blades, the Berkeley-based co-founder of MoveOn.org. She's a mediation lawyer and is leading such conversations. I've done one with her in my living room, getting left and right together. So let me just wind up here by saying that there is a debate to have about the very role of crossover debate. Some people say no. If you're talking to the enemy, you're weak, and it's hopeless. Frank Rich did a review of my book, and he said, "Oh, let these people just die of their votes." And Hochschild's too empathic, and hold on to your anger. And okay, I think he's mistaken. There's the question of, if you decide to talk across the divide, who do you do it with? And I think you're not going to do it with David Duke, or the alt-right, but there are, by some estimates, 8 million voters who in 2012 voted for Barack Obama, and in 2016 voted for Donald Trump. Maybe they'd be worth talking with. There are, among white high school educated men and women, estimates vary, 1 out of 3 in one study, 1 out of 4 in another, would have voted for Bernie Sanders. But since he didn't become the Democratic candidate, they voted for Donald Trump. Maybe these people would be interesting to see whether there are strips of common ground that can be won. So I can say a little bit more about what I myself have learned about the psychological tricks involved. I should say tricks the wrong word, but methods for what I've come to call symbol stretching and symbol skipping that do facilitate the possibility of dialogue. So I think there's something hopeful we can do, and I want us to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. So Steve Hayward has become sort of everybody's now go-to conservative on campus, in part because he, in fact, is conservative, in fact, because he happens to be a nice guy and one can talk to him. He is the senior resident scholar at the Institute for Government Studies here at Cal. He's also a visiting lecturer at Berkeley Law, which is what Bolt School is now called. He was previously the Ronald Reagan Distinguished Visiting Professor at Pepperdine, and he was a visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He was also a longtime fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's been a senior fellow at the Pacific Research Institute in San Francisco since 1991. He writes frequently for the New York Times, for the Washington Post, for the Wall Street Journal, National Review, Weekly Standard, and other publications. He is the author of 6 books, and I would like to welcome Steve to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Dan, and thanks for the Goldman School for putting this together and extending the invitation. I don't know how many of you here are Goldman supporters or alums or friends and supporters. I don't get up there as often as I would like to, mostly because I'm lazy and I'd prefer to walk downhill instead of uphill. But when I do go there, I'm always astounded at the level of energy. It's as busy as Grand Central Station, and I'm always overwhelmed by it. That's not true of a lot of departments and programs, right? So those of you who are friends of Goldman should be very proud of the place, I think, even if it is a nest of liberals. I'll add it's a really great honor to share the stage with Arlie. Yeah, we have different viewpoints and could probably tangle a lot on particulars, and I actually hope we will at some point. Maybe not so much today, because there's a lot of overlap between what you think and I think. What's great about her book, and all of her books, I haven't read them all, I've just read a couple, but is that she practices a method I encourage to students. I teach mostly political philosophy and law, and I always say the first rule of interpretation, I think, whether you're talking about a thinker or another human being, is the first thing you should try to do is understand the person as they understand themselves before you try to understand them differently or better. They may be mistaken, there may be defects, there may be bad motives or mixed motives, but figure out what they think first. Too often these days we default to our own cliches about people who disagree with us and interest and all the rest of that, and that actually stops sensible public discussion and deliberation. So Arlie's book is And spending, 5 years there, that's a model of how this ought to be done. I do think Louisiana is a strange place. I've thought about it a lot myself. I've only visited. I haven't done what Arlie's done. Oddly enough, it was one of the first of the Deep South states to break from the Democratic Party on the presidential level. It first voted for Dwight Eisenhower in 1956. Then it returned to the Democratic fold for a long time. Then Nixon wins, of course, in 72. Ronald Reagan wins it easily. Then Bill Clinton gets it back. And then the other thing I observe of it is it was the last of the Deep South states to turn wholly Republican. It wasn't until just 3 years ago that the voters finally turned out the last Democratic senator, Mary Landrieu. We'll see how this goes. I'm watching this Alabama election. I'm a conservative Republican, but sometimes party loyalty is asking too much, and I'm not sure this Roy Moore guy is going to win. Latest poll this week, it's dead even, which is, in a certain way, that's a landslide for Democrats in Alabama these days, to be dead even. But, they've picked one really crazy candidate. I'll just add one more personal note. I didn't attend Cal, neither did my wife. We like to think we're Cal boosters, though. My wife went to that little technical trade school down the peninsula in Palo Alto. Yeah, right, there you go. Oh, it gets better. She played the trombone in that anarchist troupe they call a marching band, where she found herself in the end zone on a particular famous game some of you may remember. And, she was in a class with John Elway, who, my wife reflected later, I'm so glad there wasn't social media in those days because the band was really unpopular, right, on the campus. And she was in a class with John Elway, who said, "You maniacs," actually he used a different adjective beginning with M, but "you maniacs cost me the Heisman Trophy. So go Bears, and we're on your side." So I'm glad I can bring a few smiles because I want to approach this topic on a broader scale first and then focus down on the narrower question of the white working class. And my general theme is things are much worse than they seem. This is actually not a new thought. It's an expression of what I call Hayward's first law of insufficient paranoia, which holds that no matter how bad things look on the surface, when you look closer, you find out things are usually worse. So I want to talk a little bit, I'm a political scientist, I'm going to do it this way. I haven't done the on-the-ground one-on-one work that Arlie has, because political scientists don't do that. I'm struck by a couple of survey results of long standing that ought to be on the mind and suggest the collapse of civic culture in this country that's been going on for quite a long time. One number that Gallup has been asking since the late 1950s, or one survey question is, do you have confidence in the federal government to do the right thing all the time or most of the time? Back in the late 50s, that number was 75% of people who said, yes, I have confidence in the federal government. For at least 15 years, that number has been around 15%. It struggles to get to 18%. If you look at the long-term trend line, which I think is what you try and do with consistent public opinion surveys, it blips up a couple of times. Once, ironically, is under Ronald Reagan, when that line reverses and goes up for a while. And then, of course, for some months or a couple of years after 9/11, when there's the rally around the country atmosphere, that, of course, proved evanescent, as I thought it would. By the way, I don't have time today. I have Hayward's second law of symmetric paranoia I can tell you about, too, but that's another one. So there's that. Now, it turns out that the surveys also ask, what do you think of state and local government? And those numbers are higher. People have higher confidence in state government, higher confidence in local government. And I think that's not surprising. I think that government's closer to where people live, and you can actually meet your representatives and executives more directly. On the other hand, we're seeing a collapse of the civic culture on the local level. The turnout for the last mayor's election in Los Angeles, I think, was 18% of eligible voters. Philadelphia and New York also had, I think it was 28% in New York for Mayor de Blasio. Let me say more about that in a bit, but that's a really remarkable thing. The number that really ought to bother us, and this one predates Trump. It's been growing for a while. We know as a general matter that the surveys show declining trust in institutions. People are increasingly lack confidence in churches, big business, universities, the police. The military holds up pretty well. Courts, lawyers, go on down the list, right? It's all sort of gone down. So it's not just government or Washington that people are getting skeptical of. But there's one question that really jumps out at me. Do you have trust or confidence in your fellow citizens? That number used to be 70% yes. Now it's getting close to 60% no. In other words, it's not just institutions that we're doubting now, we're doubting each other. As I say, I think it needs to be known, that's a superficial number. I'm not happy with it. I don't want to overstate it, and that's the kind of phenomenon that's very hard to figure out with follow-up surveys, although I think it really needs to. But the general point, I think, stands. When we come to think of each other as wholly alien, we lose the capacity to be fellow citizens. So that's point one. I have 3 points here. The second point is demographics. So the white working class is the swing vote in American politics, at least in electoral terms. Let's look at the states where they made the difference this year. The white vote as a whole, forget stratifying from working class, middle class, professional class. It used to be about 80% of the electorate back when Ronald Reagan wins in 1980. Now it's down to about 68% and declining, as Frank Rich likes to celebrate. So it's a smaller share of the electorate. But it's been true, I think, for a long time that the white working class, people with high school educations, living often not in the big cities, they've been de-aligning from the Democratic Party for a long time, but didn't really become partisan Republicans necessarily. They do account for what made Ronald Reagan's victories into landslides. If you had sort of just a traditional Republican candidate, Reagan wins, I think, pretty easily, but especially in 1984, the people we called Reagan Democrats made that 84 election into a massive landslide. Some of you who know this may know that Macomb County, Michigan, that's sort of the great swing county, it went big for Reagan. Bill Clinton got a lot of those voters back, and kept them, and a lot of them stayed with Barack Obama, as Arlie mentioned, although a lot of them just didn't vote for several elections under President Bush, George W. Bush, and then also under Obama. A lot of them stayed home. So they are, in political science terms, the median voter. That's the term we political scientists use, the ones who are who determine the outcome of elections. Arlie mentioned something that I've seized upon. I usually talk about it this way. I was struck during the primaries, especially in the states that had open primaries, the number of people who'd showed up in polls and talked to bewildered journalists who said, I'm undecided between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You would think that there could be no greater difference than a sort of Vermont socialist and a Manhattan billionaire. But there you were, and as the survey data shows, I don't know if you mentioned the numbers, Arlie, but the surveys say between 20 and 30% of Bernie voters voted for Trump in November. I don't think this is entirely brand new. If you go back and look at the 1972 Democratic primaries, a lot of voters would show up in polls saying, on the Democratic primaries, would say they were undecided between George Wallace and George McGovern. That also doesn't make a lot of sense if you think you're sort of politically engaged person. But the point is, these voters are sort of non-aligned and up for grabs. And as I say, Bill Clinton did a very good job of reaching them. Now, Arlie suggested, I didn't quite put it this way, but the way I took it or the way I'd modify it is, a lot of these voters are saying, no one's talking to us. You just want to say that. I think this is right. What did the Republicans offer the white working class? Well, think back 4 years ago. Republicans offered Mitt Romney. Nice, decent man, but what is he? He's a, Wall Street guy, essentially, who did what? Talked about the 47% who won't vote for me because they don't pay taxes. The kind of thing Ronald Reagan would never have said and wouldn't have thought. And what was his economic plan? Now, of course, Paul Ryan was his running mate. I know Paul, I like him, I agree with him on a lot of things, but they both suffer the defect of their economic plan was, well, the investor class is who we have to have tax cuts for. For the record, I disagree with that now. That might have made sense in 1980. I think it makes much less sense now, but that's a subject for another time. But that's what they're offering. So, if you're the unemployed coal miner, the unemployed auto worker in Wisconsin or Ohio, does that have any appeal to you? I don't think so. And so it was very easy for the Obama campaign to run a campaign against Richie Rich. I mean, Romney just sort of had it. John McCain was no better 4 years before. He adopted a tax cut plan because he thought, or maybe some of you have heard this or maybe not, it's part of conservative lore. The late political journalist Robert Novak said that God put the Republican Party on the planet to cut taxes, and other than that, they're not worth a darn. And they're trying to prove that again right now. So that brings you to Trump. What did Trump do? It's really weird to say he was an effective communicator about a person who does not speak in complete sentences, right? But he treated them with respect. Here I think you want to contrast. I mean, we know, Hillary Clinton really did walk back as fast as she could to remark about so many of Trump's supporters are from a basket of deplorables, racist and all the rest of that. And that was, I think she knew immediately that was a mistake to say something like that. But remember, she also said, we're going to put a lot of coal miners and coal mining companies out of business. Now that got seized upon and exploited by Trump, who said, what? I love coal miners. Right? This is just say, what did Romney say? I don't know what he said, but I'm sure it was like, well, we're going to work on a research program on carbon capture and sequestration so we can keep our coal-fired power plants going. Which is going to move absolutely nobody. To be fair to Hillary, she did say, and I think this is an important point, she did say, the whole context, she said, look, I want to have a program that invests a lot of money in job retraining and to build new industries for the coal miners who are unemployed. That got left out. The problem, though, is that I don't think those promises from politicians are believable anymore. Liberal politicians in particular have been promising to revive Appalachia since Lyndon Johnson, and I think now people don't believe that much anymore. So that's why it didn't get covered, why it didn't work. Plus, people remembered that Hillary said, you're a bunch of deplorables, right? I don't think that worked terribly well. I'll conclude with this. I was an anti-Trumper. I didn't think he could possibly win the nomination. I didn't think he could possibly win the election. I thought the Republicans have nominated the only person who could lose to Hillary Clinton. And conversely, I think it is possible Bernie Sanders might have beaten Trump. You don't know what would have happened in a sustained fall campaign, but I think there's a plausible case for that. I have come reluctantly to the view that maybe the pro-Trump people are right that he was the only Republican who could beat Hillary Clinton. I have a whole lot of reasons for thinking that. One of the curious things is the case against that. I'll just do it this way. I thought, yeah, Trump's going to turn out a lot of those disaffected white working class voters who've been staying at home or not voting or maybe voting for Obama twice. But he was going to lose so many voters. He was going to lose a lot of, especially suburban women, and he did. A lot of traditional Republican strongholds, he did very poorly. He barely won Orange County, where Romney won handily 4 years ago. And I didn't think he would make up those numbers. He actually got more Hispanic votes than Romney did. I thought it was going to plunge Hispanic votes, Republicans down into the single digits, like Republican share of the black vote, right? He got 33%, something like that. Romney got 30 or 29. I'm still baffled by that, although I've, heard things. Anyway, and then a lot of Republicans who had opposed Trump, like Marco Rubio in Florida, Pat Toomey in Pennsylvania, ran far ahead of him in those states. So you'd say, surely Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or somebody, pick anybody, maybe even Ted Cruz, really unappealing guy, would have run better based on how so many Republican members of Congress ran more strongly than Trump did. I'm not sure that's correct. I actually think, and especially in the case of Ron Johnson, who won a very narrow re-election in Wisconsin, that Trump brought them in on their coattails. Those candidates kept a lot more of the traditional Republican vote than Trump did, but their margins of all those voters who came out for Trump and then voted kind of in a straight ticket fashion, because straight ticket voting has been coming back for the last 20 years, actually made it bigger. So at this point, people ask me to predict the future and say, look, I can't even predict the past. I was so bad about all this. I don't know what to predict, but there we are. That's sort of my reading on things, and I'll just stop there and we can go to questions.
Thank you, Steve. Now we're going to call on Shana from the Berkeley Forum to ask the first two questions, and then we'll move to the conversation. Shana?
Thanks so much to GSPP for partnering with us, and to the panelists for being here today. We're really excited to get the opportunity to work with this event, and I'm really excited to get the opportunity to ask a couple questions. So with that in mind, you both spoke in your speeches about, in different respects, a deep cultural divide and a sort of lack of trust in fellow citizens that you see as having developed either in recent years or over the course of several decades. What factors do you see as having created these cultural differences, to a certain extent, resentment and antipathy, and where do you see this going in the future?
Do you want to go first?
All right. It's a great question, and I think in a way I touched on part of it, that the structural mechanisms through which we used to get to know each other across divides of region, class, race, aren't really serving us. They're not there. And so I think that's part of the problem, that sociological studies show that in general, when people get to know each other, they become neighbors, they like each other, that there's contact in general produces that result. So separation would be one thing I would do. And then I would say that actually there's, for I think economic reasons, a new structural divide. And for people on the coasts and highly educated people, actually things are getting better. And for working class people, things are getting worse. And I think Trump spoke to a sense of loss and fear and sadness. I mean, sometimes he can look very grim, and I thought, whoa, kind of like that. But in a way, it was like, this is bad, and I think Hillary had a good news face, you know, smiling. Look, there's an American dream. We just have to work. We'll get there. So I think that there are different economic fates, and that Trump spoke to the fate of an important sector, white working class, and he presented himself as a savior. I think it was like a secular rapture, coming down, and you too can be like me. So I think they're being had, but I think that was the very powerful appeal. Different economic fates of these sectors. Steve, what would you do with that?
Yeah, people being had. Well, I won't disagree to the extent that there's something absolutely fantastically impossible about a populace coming from a 55-story luxury tower in Manhattan. Populists come from Nebraska. Right? William Jennings Bryan. This is the weirdest thing ever. I think he has some instincts for this that are quite interesting. I think I'll just put this again in a broader context. This isn't just happening here, right? This is happening in Europe. It's happening in a lot of the leading industrial democracies. Just to pick two examples, there's the Brexit vote. On election night, Bill Clinton, very shrewd guy, said, boy, I guess this Brexit thing is for real. And if you follow that, the Brexit vote was, what made a majority was a odd coalition of a lot of working class labor voters. You remember the Brexit, both party establishments were against it. And then you had a lot of the conservative vote in the rural areas that put it over the top, a completely unlikely coalition ideologically. The French vote, if you look at the geographical distribution of Marine Le Pen, who still got, almost 40% of the vote for president, a really nasty person. And it's Austria last week, and then Germany here recently. So Germany maybe is most interesting. You have this very right-wing party that came from 0 to 85 seats in the Bundestag at a time when the economy is doing really well. I don't think Germany has our kind of problem with a quote-unquote white working class of less educated people with dismal economic prospects or an opioid problem and all those things. So it's happening everywhere. And immigration's part of it. I think we have to acknowledge that. The survey data about Brexit showed that was on the mind of a lot of the pro-Brexit voters, even though that's really not what the original impulse against the European Union is. And, we don't like these Brussels people. By the way, if you've never, a lot of you probably have seen the old Yes, Prime Minister series. It's 30 years old, but there's all stuff about what's wrong with Brussels in there that sounds very contemporary. I used some scenes from that old series in classes. Holds up extremely well. So I think that's part of it. I mentioned one other thing quickly. I don't want to go on too long, but another thing that surprised me was that Trump got the highest share ever of Republicans of evangelical and religious voters, well over 80%. I mean, I can remember when Jimmy Carter got the majority of those votes, because of course he was a well-advertised born-again Christian. And I would have thought, okay, evangelicals, they don't care for liberals and Democrats in Washington and so forth, but I mean, Trump? I mean, come on, right?
When he was asked, what chapter of the Bible was his favorite? Well, I like them all.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, or there was this that great moment at Liberty University when, the way I render it was, 2 Corinthians walk into a bar, right? So that was just, right? I mean, it was so, I will say, he did punch all their hot buttons on abortion, and I think it's important. But then also, I don't want to go too long here. I do think that part of that phenomenon can be explained in the title of one court case, and that was United States versus Little Sisters of the Poor. Not even the big sisters of the poor, right? I mean, there's a lot more cases. There's the Hobby Lobby case and other stuff, and this opens up onto the controversies over transgenderism and bathrooms and all these things that exploded almost out of nowhere for the last couple of years. And look, a lot of, there's some survey, and the media misses this, because I think the media, they don't understand this world, they don't cover it very well, right? Despite occasional sporadic attempts to try. But a lot of evangelicals thought that, the government is hostile to us. We think it's going to get worse under Hillary Clinton. And so we're going to swallow any personal reservations we have about Donald Trump and vote for him in big numbers. I think that's something that liberals ought to reckon with some.
Well, along those lines, with this deep cultural difference, You both spoke about how the Democratic Party has failed to reach these voters and how similar trends are being seen across Europe with traditional social democratic parties. Do you think there's a way for the Democratic Party or parties like Labour in the European Union to recapture some of their traditional vote in the white working class, and what would that look like?
Okay, yes. You know, to go back to the deep story, I think it isn't immigrants that are cutting in line, or not only, and not blacks. They haven't really improved their family income in the last 40 years. So, I don't think it's women. I believe it's robots that are actually cutting in line. If we look, and neither left nor right are talking about automation. Automation is, I think, it's the elephant in the living room, and it's already hit the white working class first, and it's coming to the middle class, and fast. I believe that Donald Trump's policies exacerbate the rate of automation, but that you ask how to address the issue, I would address that issue head on. Now, what can be done? Job retraining, and as you said, Hillary did have that, but people haven't seen it close up. They haven't seen it work. Let me just tell you, I think, a great story about a Democratic congressman, Ro Khanna. He represents Silicon Valley and Google, Facebook, Intel, Yahoo. That's his constituency. He said to me on the phone, you know, half my constituency are Asian. I'm Asian myself. But I made an alliance with a Republican congressman from Paintsville, Kentucky. And I brought a job training program to learn coding for apps for cell phones. They set up a program in Paintsville that had these unemployed coal miners. And there they were learning how to do coding. It's a 2-year program, it's paid for, and they were promised a $40,000 a year job if they passed this course. And the first 30 have graduated. And you know what they call themselves? Silicon Hollow. I think that's a way to really address this issue and cross the divide, too.
Oh, we're in heated agreement on this point, especially the automation one. I mean, if you think it's bad when someone says they shipped my job to Mexico, wait till you get they gave my job to a robot. And boy, the whole, so, you know, there's actually been maps of this. What's the leading job for an unskilled or high school educated white male, and actually male, it doesn't have to be white, driving trucks, cabs, delivery services, Ubers, things like that. And they pay pretty well for the most part, you know. You can get a high school degree, and if you want to move to Williston, North Dakota, you can make $90,000 a year to start driving one of those oil trucks. You got to have a class 3 license, whatever it is, but that's not too hard to get. And if that goes away, oh, that could be huge.
These are male jobs, too.
Yes,
I was looking at a McKinsey study, you can get it online, of automation. And what it does is look at skills and study some 80 different occupations, and a lot of them are white male jobs. For example, on the oil rigs, we're moving from hiring, the Petros are 10 guys per rig to 5.
Yeah.
The 5 are lost jobs due to automation.
Yeah.
And it's hard to get mad at a robot. You know?
Well, I mean,
the
Luddites used to smash them up, the early versions, so we may see that. I don't know. There's a second aspect, though, that I think is a huge opening for Democrats. Trump doesn't really have very good answers for any of this. He could easily lose a lot of those voters. I think I could also easily keep them. I could explain that. But on the policy front, what did Trump say? I'm going to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. well, where is that, right? It's not really happening. Republicans don't really have a lot of enthusiasm for that because that's old-fashioned spending and the deficit's really huge.
And it's to privatize roads, and
well,
what's public would be private.
There's all kinds of problems in the details of it. But I think the opening for Democrats would be to say, where's that infrastructure Trump promised us? We'll do it.
Right.
And you could get a little further down the road and even localize and say, we're going to do this in Ohio, we're going to do this in Wisconsin, and these jobs will start. I think that's a huge opening that Trump is leaving for them. So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you guys so much for answering my questions.
So we're talking about feelings of dislocation, being pushed out of line. Is there a basis from, let's just say, left and right to have some kind of 99% coalition, not the 1%, or a working class coalition? And where does race fit into that? And are these people who you seem to really like, does race interfere with that kind of coalition? And how do parties on either side deal with that?
Great. I look to the Reverend William Barber II. He's the Moral Mondays guy who is really, I think, the heritor of the tradition of Martin Luther King. And what he does is take race, but he incorporates other issues. And he is now organizing a national movement for poor children. So you've got both class and race there. And for Mother's Day. So he's a symbol hitter too. This coming Mother's Day, he's organized 30 cities. I just heard him give a talk in New York. So I think that's the way to go. I think race has long been there, and it racism raises its ugly head every so often. The 1890s, the 1920s under Woodrow Wilson, he was really like a Ku Klux Klan guy. So nothing new, actually, with Trump. But he's reawakened this racism in a terrifying way. And I think I think our way is to address it head on, to get out of our silos. I guess that would be my message to Berkeley. Let's not just talk to each other and scold each other. That in a way, a healthy moral impulse, I think, has been turned inward. And what we need to do, and it's sort of focused on language and particular identities. And I think what we need to do is get back to what Berkeley was an extraordinary model for. This was a class of 1968 that really knew about social movements to address real issues. And so I guess I'm answering it more in terms of what we should do, but I don't think in the book that I talk about race a lot, but the people that I talk to kind of say, oh, I know that you guys think we're racist. Just hang around and come back and hang around and come back. And sort of race was talked a little bit about, but they were very eager not to be associated with the alt-right in Charlottesville. So I guess what this tells us is that there are a sector of white working class people who do feel a grievance as white working class people, but who don't want to be associated in our minds or theirs with racist policies. So there's something to work with there. They're not all deplorable.
So I have two thoughts if I can split it in half. One is, I actually think, you talk about 90% overlap. That may be a little ambitious, but I think there...
Well, no, I meant the 1% versus the 90%.
Oh, well, that's where I'm going with all that. Oh, okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. So I actually think there is an opening now to consider the idea of a universal basic income. There are a number of people on the right who've been, the most unlikely person of all, Charles Murray wrote a book 10 years ago saying we ought to have a universal basic income. He did the math. It'd be more expensive than our current menu of welfare services, but
Friedman was the one who first put it forward.
Right, and of course it went down in flames when Nixon proposed a version of it. That's an interesting story. But if you think about two things, one is if you get this fast automation revolution, it will even deepen the trend we're seeing now. That here's something liberals are absolutely right about: almost all the gains, what little economic growth we're having, is going to the upper income, the first 2, 3, 4, 5%. Right? That is a huge problem. Now it gets worse if you have this sort of broad-scale automation. Just think of if you're a big trucking company, what happens to your profit margins if you get rid of an entire labor force that you've got to pay health insurance for and all these things? They make out like bandits, right? They do really well. So universal basic income, and as I say, there are a number of conservatives who are for it, and I think there's a space to think about that. Now, on the question of, and there's something of appeal, especially to those non-aligned working class voters, that we're going to do something that at least promises some stability in your life and your economic circumstance. A lot to be said about that. Now, the question of race. So how much time have we got? Let me just make one general comment about it that I think it's been lost in some of the particular ways we're fighting about it these days. And here there's a parallel with environmental issues, I think. I was an environmental policy wonk, and I was reading with great interest some of your descriptions of circumstances, scratching my head on some of them. But I think there's a similarity between the environmental controversies we have and the racial controversies we have that is not noticed. And I think this is only one aspect, but it's one that's lost. In the case of the environment and in the case of race, we did the easy things 40, 50 years ago. We passed the Clean Air Act, we passed the Clean Water Act, we built secondary wastewater treatment for sewage. All that stuff it cost money, and then the Civil Rights Act got rid of state action and discriminatory laws. Now we're trying to get at the hard stuff. In the environment, we're trying to get after stormwater runoff of farm fields, which is not, you can't fix it with a pipe or a regulation from the EPA. It's a lot harder. It's difference by circumstance. And I take very seriously all the work on implicit racial bias, and I should follow some of the literature on this. And there you can't fix that with a law. We can try some, but it's a lot harder problem with subtle forms of discrimination that happen against minorities and women. And so first of all, it does need to be recognized. Can I just tell a quick story? Sorry, I don't want to go too long. At Pepperdine, which is a conservative school, I had a number of black students, some of whom were conservative Republicans. They love Ronald Reagan. Couldn't tell them enough about Ronald Reagan. You know what else they liked? They liked Black Lives Matter a lot. I thought, this is interesting. Tell me more about this, right? And they didn't always agree with their tactics. They says, no, I don't think they should block roads and other things, but they're with them. And that's because in every case, in one case, this one young lady I had in the class, her father's a very prosperous doctor, lives in Westlake, so she drives a fancy car, like most students at Pepperdine do. And she gets pulled over a lot for stuff like not having a turn signal on. Usually doesn't get a ticket, but everybody knows what's going on there. That's why she likes Black Lives Matter, right? And I have other students tell me the same stories, right? So, and I will do a mea culpa that conservatives have been too resistant to taking this seriously. And then partly they get called racist and they say, fine, I'm going to check out and do something else, right? And so we don't talk about these things at all. So that's what I'd say. My view is this is actually a lot harder than passing the Civil Rights Act, which was really hard, as everyone knows. And so we do have a lot to do on that, and it's going to be hard.
Let me pose a political question. Hillary was a damaged candidate. There had been decades of efforts to discredit her, to create a narrative that she was untrustworthy, she was whatever. So whatever the merits of her individually, she was a very damaged candidate. She almost won, despite everything else.
Yeah.
What's wrong with Democrats going back to the Obama coalition, not pandering or reaching out or trying to incorporate these white working class voters, and just have a less damaged candidate? And what does that mean for the prospects of, number one, winning the presidency? But then there's a second question: what does that mean for being able to govern? because Obama was able to win, but he was barely able to govern because he didn't have a Congress in support. So how do you view these issues going forward?
That's a great question. In other words, if we'd just gotten the vote out, the Democratic vote out, we could be in a different situation. You've raised two issues. One is, why talk to these people? Is that misspent energy? And I think that's a great question we have to ask. And my personal answer is this, that the times call for, I'm speaking about two progressives, such as myself, for three pillars of activism. The first is to do everything we can to preserve a system of checks and balances and democracy itself. We never thought we'd have to, but I think that's the first goal. So that means the independence of the press, the judiciary. It's pillar one. And you don't even have to talk to Trump voters to get active on that. Pillar two is electoral politics and the revamping of the Democratic platform so that it speaks to some of the grievances, including the robots cutting in line. And that, again, you don't need to talk to anybody to do that. But pillar three, and I'm giving these in order, in my view, of priority. So I don't think that talking across the line is the most important thing, actually. But I do believe that it can help us with pillar one and pillar two if we know how folks out there that are Trump supporters, how they see things. So we'll know how to talk to them. And again, we can select who we talk to. As per, it could be the former Obama supporters, it can talk to former Bernie supporters, talk to them perhaps first. And so you don't have to talk to people you disagree with, but you do, I believe, have to appreciate that doing so can help you in what should be a coordinated three-pillar approach to this political moment.
Yeah, so I guess what I think, two thoughts. It might work, but I think there's some good reasons to think it might not. And don't take my word for it. Just check in with Rui Teixeira and John Judas, who wrote the book, The Emerging Democratic Majority, in 2001. They've changed their mind a bit. They're saying, we're not so sure it actually works. Those are two lovely guys, by the way. I like them both a ton. I know them a little bit. And I could go through some of the reasons why, but that would take too long. But I think a simpler one is this. There's really no substitute for charisma in politics, and boy, did Obama have that. Right, and Trump, in a certain animalistic way, had it too, right? And this is problematic in politics, right? Going back at least to Max Weber and all his talk about charisma. And I mean, it really does count for a lot. So right now, yeah, people. That's just why there's a lot of excitement for Kamala Harris, she might have that too once she gets out and starts going. Maybe Cory Booker. Maybe one or two others, that they might be able to recapture that magic. But I think it's more that than demographics. I'll just add that one of my best friends knew Obama at Occidental College during his 2 years there. And they both spoke at a rally one day, and my friend's an athlete, and Obama spoke after him. I remember this because there was this picture of Obama in the New York Times 3-4 years ago, and I spotted my friend Tony there. And I called, Tony, that's you sitting there, isn't it? I recognize his physique. He says, yeah. And I remember him telling me when Obama emerged, he says, I remember that guy, and we spoke together one day, and I talked, and, smattering of applause. He got up and talked, and I said, oh my God, is that guy good? It was obvious then that this guy had it, right? Michael Barone, a very smart political analyst, done doing the Almanac of American Politics for years, he wrote after the 2008 election that he thinks Obama is maybe a one-time phenomenon. Maybe so, maybe not. We'll see. It's an open question, but I wouldn't necessarily rest my hopes on the demographic wave working the way it's been thought.
Well, let me ask just a follow-up to that. What is the future of America if we don't reach out to everybody? And what does that say about our future as a country? Oh,
well, that's very bad. Yes, right. No, I'm not. I mean, yes. I mean, I'm not sure what to add to that except to say emphatic yes.
So we want to throw this open to you all. There is a mic out here. If you have questions, if you could raise your hand, and Lynn and Hannah will reach out to you.
Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I learned so much. I hadn't thought about universal basic income, so I'm definitely going to look into that. One question that I have that was not brought up is about the role of the internet and communication via the internet, and the way that we're drawn into these silos of communication. So one example would be myself being progressive, so I would be, let's say, looking at Robert Reich's posts on Facebook. But the other day, I decided to look at a post on Fox News, which was of a speech that Paul Ryan gave the other day at a dinner where he was being humorous, and there was some criticism of it. So I thought, oh, I want to see what people are saying. So I clicked on it, and as he was speaking, it was a video. People had an opportunity to comment on it or to say whether they liked it or if they loved it or if they hated it, and a lot of people hated it. But what was so offensive to me was when I saw the comments, and so many of them were about build the wall, build the wall, build the wall. I'm a person who has a strong feeling about that. I grew up in San Diego near the border. I'm Mexican American. So it was just so interesting, but I just had a glimpse into that silo. And I think that those silos, I mean, they're so important, and they've influenced people so much around the country. For example, among so the groups that we've been talking about, the white middle class, and I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about that? How do we bridge that divide? Because it's so hard. If you're talking to people, at least you can talk, but in internet, it's silos, and we're very separated.
Thank you.
That's a great comment. Yes, I think technology can help us and it can hurt us. What I found in my time in Louisiana was that often people to talk with were open. They would say, oh, Trump, I'd say, do you have any hesitations? They'd say, oh, where do I begin? They were open. They were nuanced. There could be a discussion. But then I would look at their Facebook page and go, you gods, There would, for example, after this whole NFL situation and athletes taking the knee during the national anthem, one guy said, well, I'm boycotting the New Orleans Saints because some of the, and I also then saw a very telling thing on Facebook of two pictures, one of white male GIs, and it said average wage, $35,000, and next to it, and patriotic, okay, and next to it was a picture of NFL black athletes, average wage $9 million and won't pledge. So this was on a Facebook page. It really told me where the feelings were, but I didn't hear it in personal conversations. So technology reveals things, but you need to be face to face to gradually get at those differences, I think.
Yeah, boy, that's a big subject. Two things have changed. One is we used to have a common culture in our media. It wasn't perfect, but 3 networks. Everybody watched I Love Lucy. A third of America watched Walter Cronkite. Now, that's that, and people talk about the water cooler the next day. Now that's all gone. Now, that wasn't perfect, right? I mean, there were hardly any blacks on TV for a very long time. And maybe the only Hispanic was Ricky Ricardo. I'm not quite sure what to be made of him, but, right? And by the way, the proliferation now, I mean, I think we're in the golden age of television. Some of the best writing being done today is on these TV shows, but you can pick your specialties. You can't keep up with it. That's great. But the fragmentation happens. Then on the media side, Well, we've democratized the media, right? Anybody can now comment on and millions of people or thousands can see what you saw in the comment thread. It used to be you had to write a letter to the editor, and it wouldn't get printed if it was abusive and foul, or it might get edited, right? But it took time. I think a lot about the news cycle. As recently as the 80s, and I wrote a book about the Reagan presidency, and even before that, back in the 60s, it really starts. The cycle for a White House would be you wake up and see what's on the morning papers, and that's what I got to cope with today. Now, this particular presidency, you wake up in the morning and say, oh my God, what did the boss tweet last night? It's going to make my morning miserable. But the point is now these things play out in real time. By 10 o'clock, you've had a whole news cycle over it. And it's just making things way more chaotic, and it's just getting worse. I don't know any way to fix that, unfortunately. It's the new world we're living in. There's no putting that genie back in the bottle, but it's a huge problem.
There is an app now. Again, if you look at the Bridge Alliance, it's called All Sides. Actually, it's a Republican that's put it together.
Yeah, I know the guy. Yes, he's a friend of mine. Yeah.
That takes the same news item. As it is dealt with left, right, and center. And so you can kind of see what the perspective was, what the source was. So it's called All Sides.
There's a question over here.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with Steve's comment that things are much worse than we're oftentimes willing to acknowledge. And in that regard, I wonder if both panelists could speak to the issue of fake news. We talk about having a dialogue with people. But when the president can just say, it's not true, it's hard to have the dialogue going forward. Although I'm a progressive, I was willing to accept everything Steve stated here as facts in terms of the number of people that said that. But if you have the point where that's all wrong, totally can't accept it. So I'm interested in that. And the other one is, I was a TV executive, so it's painful for me to say this. But I think the media has contributed so much to this and the commercial aspects of it. First of all, the celebrity apprentice, Donald Trump. I mean, he was on there to make money, pure and simple, and that's put him up in the high levels of recognition and the like. But the other thing on that is I was very bothered during the presidential debates, when the party debates, Republicans and Democrats, they were commercially sponsored. I mean, unbelievable. You're not possible to give up 15 minutes of commercials for a presidential debate, and that reflects the fact that Trump got such a disproportionate amount of coverage. Why? Ratings. Why? Translates to money. So when we talk about systematic challenges we're facing, I would put commercial media in that mix. But I'd love your comments on that.
Steve, why don't you take that first?
Well, I'm tempted to say maybe what we ought to do is a simple reform. That those presidential debates, the two candidates ought to look like NASCAR cars and races, where they've got the sponsors' logos all over their jackets. That might be helpful. Look, this isn't new either. The media is sensational. They go for conflict. They sacrifice depth. They do a disservice to everybody. The media is mostly liberal, but they're more interested in conflict than they are in their ideology. So the fake news problem, I'm not quite sure which way I should go here on this. Maybe I'll do this, because I think I haven't been cranky enough. I'm going to blame the left. Here's why. This came up with alternative facts. Remember, that's the other version of it, is what's her, Kellyanne Kellyanne. I used to know her 25 years ago. She was Kellyanne Fitzpatrick. Anyway, she talked about alternative facts, not to get really upset. And I sit back and I say, well, and this could go on a long time, I don't want to, but I sort of think back to Nietzsche, a philosopher I'm going to run to mommy, right? He said, there are no facts, there is only interpretation. That's actually the cornerstone of what goes by the banner of postmodernism these days, and linguistic skepticism and lots of other things. And I think there's something to all that, but my sort of comeback is if it's really true that the world is dominated by subjectivity, and sometimes you even hear from the postmodern left that objectivity itself doesn't exist or is a social construct or all these things, I sort of say, you guys carried this problem. I don't see what the problem is. So Good, that provoked Arlie. So I didn't want to be completely too agreeable here, right? That's a thumbnail sketch, by the way, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I thought you were going to go into, how the New York Times collects its facts with, I think it's got 80 different, foreign correspondents, and they're trained journalists, and there's fact-checking with it compared to, Fox News reporters. So,
well, can I just interrupt to say I was I was part of the conservative project a year ago for what we call the Recriminations Project when Trump lost. And I was one of the persons who was going to write the cover story for a magazine of what's wrong with Fox News. I'll just say that for the record. But
yeah.
That all went poof, unfortunately.
That's good. Well, I take what you're saying, that in a way, fake news as a huge and central issue is kind of postmodernism gone haywire. Let's make it not go haywire. I don't have any, great solutions to this, but it comes up all the time when I talk to people on the other side. And what I generally say is, "Oh, where did you hear that? What's the source on that?" And then they would kind of, "Oh, well, gee, what is the source?"
Can I just add a quick footnote? If you haven't seen it, there was a remarkable interview the last week or 10 days in Der Spiegel with Macron, the new president of France. Absolutely fascinating. And in the middle, he said something to warm my heart. He said, "I think postmodernism is one of the worst things to happen to modern politics." So I called up a friend of mine who's a White House correspondent, Deborah Saunders from the Las Vegas Review-Journal, who's a Francophile. She's French, travels their lives. Said, "Deborah, read this interview, and if you can, ask President Trump, do you agree with President Macron that postmodernism is the worst thing to happen to politics?" Then we'll sit back and watch the entertainment, right?
Yeah.
So we have a hard close in about a minute, but we'll have one quick.
Thanks for the great discussion. My name is Rafał Szymanowski. I'm a visiting student researcher here through Fulbright program, and I came from Europe. So because you've mentioned the European situation, I just wanted to briefly add something. I agree that there is a great social divide across the Europe, but it is much greater in Great Britain than, for example, in Germany or Belgium. And I would argue that it has a lot to do with economic policy. It is no accident that Great Britain has adopted kind of similar economic policies to the US, that Great Britain has a booming financial sector, weak labor unions, and rising income inequality. Germany still is a social market economy or a coordinated market economy. It has strong unions, therefore the extent of the social divide is much, much smaller. So I think that we have to take it into consideration. Thanks very much.
So I want to thank you all for coming. We have some gifts for our panelists. I will give them to you.
Thank you, Dan.
I want to thank the Berkeley Forum. I want to thank the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement. And you heard a lot of different letters, GSPP and Center. GSPP is the Goldman School for Public Policy. The center is within the Goldman School, just in case there was any confusion. And I hope that you come out to each of our events in the future. And again, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.